Explanations of the causes of World War I break basically into two groups. First, that it was the inevitable and predictable result of a confluence of international factors. And secondly, that it was a really poorly thought out response to an immediate crisis which could have been avoided had cooler heads prevailed. Whichever view you take, you'll need to consider four aspects of the long-term situation, as well as the short-term crisis and the immediate lead-up. The four main causes of World War I are: first, militarism, a policy which values building a strong military force, then using that force in war to get what you want, usually power, land, raw materials, or some combination of those. In this policy, prestige is measured in terms of your army or navy, or air force today, but that was less of a factor in World War I. Secondly, alliances, a system of agreements between countries to help each other if they were attacked. Basically, this resulted in two superblocks developing in Europe, the Triple Alliance on one side and the Triple Entente on the other. Thirdly, imperialism, a desire to extend your sphere of influence over other countries, where you gain raw materials and a market for manufactured goods. There was much competition between European powers for colonies in other parts of the world, as each sought to build their own empire. Lastly, nationalism. Sometimes seen as a response to the expansion of dominant nations, nationalism is essentially a patriotic pride felt by the people of a country when it succeeds. But it's also felt by people who feel that their cultural identity is being squashed by a conquering power and who consequently want to have their own nation. Conveniently, you can arrange the four causes in this order to help you remember them. M-A-I-N, the main causes of World War I. We're actually going to discuss them in a different order, but that's not significant. They were all happening concurrently, and they all contributed to the crises that resulted in war. The first element I want to discuss is imperialism, basically because it underpins all the others, although you could probably make a similar argument for the other four factors as well. Imperialism is a policy of empire building. Britain, France, Spain and Portugal were the earliest European empire builders of what they called the New World, but other nations began to shift their attention as well as we come into the mid-19th century. There were already two big empires around and in Europe, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, which was in decline. Around about this time, other previously disparate but related groups began to unify. We'll return to that under nationalism. And they joined the competition for external colonies. There was some argy-bargy over land in Europe itself, but the majority of the competition was in the New World. The late 19th century saw a scramble for Africa as the European powers competed to gain land themselves and to prevent others from gaining it. So let's look at the various empires. Britain held the largest empire in the late 19th century, and they also followed a policy of strategic exclusion. That meant that Britain controlled trade and trade routes over much of the New World, creating tensions with the other imperial powers, especially France, with whom they'd been at war for large parts of the last 400 years. On this map, you can see that the British Empire, which is marked in pink, covered nearly a quarter of the globe. In fact, it was said that the sun never set on the British Empire. Britain controlled Canada, large parts of Central Africa, coastal Arabia, the entire Indian subcontinent, part of China, and all of Australia and New Zealand, among various other smaller possessions. Because of the far-flung nature of the empire, British focus was on their navy, and we'll come back to militarism later. France, the other big colonial influence, had ceded their Canadian possessions to Britain by now, but they had had a hand in the US independence, mostly to upset Britain. The French possessions were in French Indochina, Madagascar, and most dominantly Northwest Africa. Russia mostly wanted warm water ports and prestige. Because of her geographical position, most of Russia freezes in winter, and up until this point, so did the seas around each of their shipping ports. Obviously, if you can't move ships about easily, you have difficulty in conquering lands overseas. This led Russia to seek expansion southwards by land, leading her into conflict with China and Japan. Britain and France both had economic interests in China and Japan, so that created further tensions in Europe. Attempts by Russia to expand northwest also led to conflict with Germany. So, those were the big landholders in the late 19th century. Complicating this situation, Germany and Italy also wanted in on the gains that were to be had from colonisation, but they came late to the party because they were new nations and they found their ambitions were frustrated. Italy and Germany joined what was known as the Scramble for Africa. Britain and France were already well advanced in competition there, and the newer competitors faced an uphill battle. Italy, marked here in the orangey-grey colour, was a newly unified country in 1861. Mostly they attempted to establish colonies in Africa, conducting 2 wars of conquest in Ethiopia. Note the white independent bloc in the northeast, with Italy in the north and to the east of that pushing inwards. Russia and France armed and helped Ethiopia in an initially successful attempt to frustrate Italy. Much of Italy's campaigning during World War I was directed towards consolidating power in Ethiopia and Libya and expanding into Albania, but they lost out greatly in the settlement after the war. Germany, which is marked here in green, was unified under Wilhelm I in 1871, and so they were even later to the party than Italy had been. They focused their attention on the Pacific, particularly Samoa and New Guinea and China, which brought them into conflict with Russia, Japan, Britain and America. And then they went about conquering modern Namibia, which they called German Southwest Africa, Rwanda, German East Africa, and Togo, which is on the Slave Coast further north. By this stage, though, there was little of the world left uncolonised, so competition was much tougher. They made some gains in Africa, but the overseas German Empire never really developed in the same way that the others had, and the Germans tended to focus their nationalism on expanding and consolidating their homeland in Europe. Next, let's turn to nationalism. This is a sentiment you feel when your nation does well. Let's call it patriotism with a twist. Patriotism is about advancing your state. It's the already determined legal entity that we see drawn with official borders on maps that issues your passport and things like that. Your nation is a bit different. It's more about language and ethnicity, your culture, if you will. In modern Australia, those are largely the same, but in late 19th century Europe, they were very different beings. Observe this map of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. As you can see, there are several different language groups all making up one country. A person from Sarajevo, for example, if you look towards the bottom in the browny grey bit, might feel pride in their state, Austro-Hungary, or their nation, Serbia, possibly both in different ways. Today, the countries of Europe are split up basically along the language lines with a few deviations, but that's actually a result of World War I. It wasn't the case beforehand. The earlier Austrian Empire had covered all of this land and a little bit more to the northeast, but it had lost some German speakers to the newly unified Germany. In 1867, the Austro-Hungarian Compromise essentially divided the European state into 2 independent states. So your empire becomes Austria to the west and Hungary to the east, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They did this in response to a rising sense of pride that the 2 different groups felt for their nations. The essentially Slavic and Russian peoples of the east felt different from the mainly Germanic peoples of the west, and they wanted their own state. As a compromise, the empire was internally divided, but it retained a common currency and foreign policy, so we refer to it as one country. This sense of nationalism, or pride in one's nation instead of one's state, became increasingly evident in the late 19th century. Italian speakers bonded together in 1861 to form Italy. Germanic peoples bonded together and unified into Germany in 1871. This was also a time of separatism in Ireland and Scotland, by the way, but that's another story. The French had been unified for a while, mainly because of their having been conquered by Henry V of England and then much later dominated by Napoleon Bonaparte. In fact, domination by Napoleon was a big factor in each of these unification movements, but that is definitely another story. So, nationalism is causing Europeans to coalesce into groups based on language and culture rather than on politics, and to demand a unified state to represent that culture. In the case of Germany, Italy and France, it brought people together and it fueled empire building because people wanted to advance the prestige of this new state to which they felt such pride. In the case of Austro-Hungary, which was already an empire, it resulted in a separatist movement, under which several different groups demanded independence. The Serbians in the south were particularly radical about it. When we look at the short-term causes of the war, we'll see that a young Serbian called Gavrilo Princip attempted to convince Austria to agree to a free Serbian state by assassinating their Archduke when he visited Sarajevo in June of 1914. Okay, so we've established that the European powers were competing for colonies and prestige, partly as an expression of nationalistic pride and partly fueling that pride. The process of gaining and consolidating colonies is achieved through your military. This emphasis on military superiority is referred to as militarism. In the lead-up to World War I, there was an arms race between the European powers as each sought to strengthen its military and then relied on that strength to both actively pursue conquest and to act as a deterrent to the other powers. Their military was an expression of nationalistic pride, and the successes of the military fueled that nationalistic pride. The arms race in the lead-up to World War I is most clearly demonstrated by comparing the spending of Britain and Germany. Let's look first at the navy. Britain, having an enormous and far-flung empire, prided itself on the strength and flexibility of its navy. Germany, on the other hand, had fought many wars with France, Austria, and Russia over the exact borders of its new unified state, so they had previously emphasized their army. Both countries needed to gain a competitive advantage. Germany focused attention on technology, including submarine technology. The U-boats, of which Germany had 29 by 1914, particularly alarmed Britain with their lauded naval strength. So they responded by commissioning 29 new ships, including the feared Dreadnought class. The result was that while Germany had a more advanced, more flexible, and ultimately scarier and more effective fleet, the British fleet was larger, consequently cost more to maintain, and had better strategic ports. Looking at the army, Germany already had a large army, hence the fairly consistent spending. They focused attention again on technology, the development of faster, more accurate machine guns, more portable and heavier artillery, and strategic planning. They knew that there was a possibility that they might have to fight on two fronts, so strategy was key. Britain, on the other hand, did not previously have an enormous army, compared with the amount of land that they occupied, but they did have the advantage of an enormous empire from which to draw soldiers. Initial spending on bolstering the army gave way to shipbuilding in the immediate lead-up. Into this mix you then have to throw French, Austrian and Russian spending on the military, including heightened conscription everywhere but in Britain. What you get is a system of one-upmanship, with each great power trying to keep up with and preferably outstrip each of the others. A vast, well-equipped army would deter another power from attacking you, as well as assuring that if they did, you could effectively squash them. Having huge stockpiles of bombs, bullets and so on reassured the public and acted as a source of competitive pride. While they may inspire pride and confidence, the problem with a big military is that eventually it wants to attack people, and that is unfortunately what ended up happening. Let's turn to the alliances. The balance of power in Europe had changed significantly in the 19th century, with Napoleon invading pretty much everyone, the decline of the Ottoman and Austrian empires, the scramble for colonies, and the growth of nationalism. In this newly uncertain world, each of the superpowers looked to their European friends for support. A system of alliances grew up under which each power promised A, not to invade their friends, and B, to support their friends if they were invaded by somebody else. The idea of an alliance bloc functioned partly as a deterrent, dissuading other major powers from attacking, but it also presented a danger that if there was conflict, it would be a one-in, all-in affair. This diagram here shows the various alliances that formed in Europe. The first was the League of Three Emperors and was signed in 1873 between Germany, Russia and Austria. As part of his unification program for Germany, General Bismarck had seen Germany as a peacemaker in Europe. His idea was to sign up the greatest empires to a peace compact so that he could concentrate on consolidating German power in other regions. The League dissolved again in 1878 because of tensions between Russia and Austria over territory in the Balkans following the decline of the Ottoman Empire there. Germany had taken Austria's side in a peace settlement and Russia resented it, so the League was allowed to lapse. This left Germany and Austria with a dual alliance, formalised in 1879. It had been a surprising friendship because both Austrians and Germans spoke German and there'd been tension over where the border should lie. There was also tension over nationalist unification tendencies in Germany and the splintering effects of nationalism in Austria. Nonetheless, the two countries signed their pact in 1879. In 1881, Italy joined in, forming the Triple Alliance, because they feared an attack by France. Have a look at this interesting diagram. Lots of countries feared attack by France at this time. Many historians blame Napoleon because, as Emperor of France, although he was actually Corsican, that's another story, he had invaded pretty much everyone before being defeated by the British earlier in the century in 1815. Even if you don't blame him for tensions in Western Europe, his invasion of Egypt and Syria certainly destabilized the Ottomans, and that certainly affected nationalist movements in the Balkans. But back to the alliances. Also in 1881, Austria-Hungary had signed an alliance with Serbia, part of which they later annexed as Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908. As a result of declining Ottoman power, Bosnia and Serbia had declared independence, but both Austria-Hungary and Russia were anxious to absorb the territory into their own empires. So, come time for war, Germany, Italy, Austria-Hungary and Serbia formed one superbloc, but Serbia wasn't too happy about being considered part of Austria-Hungary. The Ottomans officially signed up in a secret treaty with Germany in 1914, 2 days after the war officially started. Previously, they had definitely disliked France and Britain, thank you Napoleon, who were advancing from the Middle East, but they also resented Austria and Russia, who were picking at their northwestern borders. Most historians consider the Ottoman-German alliance mostly a marriage of convenience. So here we have the earlier of the two superblocks, an uncomfortable union formed as a result of a fear of invasion, and, if you ask General Bismarck, as a better-than-nothing effort towards peacekeeping. On the other side, the alliances formed a bit later. Bismarck's policies had effectively isolated France, who found themselves sandwiched between Allied Germany and Austria on the one side, and their old enemy and colonial rival Britain on the other. The Franco-Russian alliance of 1892 gave France the opportunity to make a powerful friend and surround Germany and Austria, and it gave Russia an opportunity to thumb their collective nose at Germany for having taken Austria's side over the Balkans. In 1904, Britain and France formalised their settlement, which had been worked out since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, as well as agreeing various disputes about colonies in Africa, Canada and Indochina. In this way, France was no longer isolated and it could concentrate on developing its colonies instead of defending them. Britain was worried about the increasing threat from German efforts in Africa. Britain's Boer War in South Africa had not gone well. And they were also worried about rapidly improving German naval technology, which we discussed earlier in the section on militarism. So by joining with France, she settled disputes she didn't have time to focus on, and she thumbed her nose at Germany. Shortly afterwards, in 1907, the Anglo-Russian Convention again settled colonial issues, this time in Persia and Central Asia. Simply put, Russia needed breathing space because revolution was rumbling, and settling disputes over Asia got Britain off her back. An added bonus was another chance to stick it to Germany and Austria-Hungary, who'd recently made friends with Japan. Russia had lost a war with Japan in 1905. So, the situation as we have it in 1914 has the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy on the one side with support from the Ottomans, and the Triple Entente, France, Britain and Russia on the other with support from their empires. They've all agreed to support each other in the event of an attack. This created the possibility of a minor incident blowing up into a major international crisis because of a chain of threats which looked basically like this. So, to recap, we've seen that the long-term causes of World War I were the military focus of each of the major powers, which made them each wary of the others and fearful of attacks. The threatening nature of this world situation led to the development of a system of alliances composed of two superblocks of heavily armed and highly suspicious nations. The suspicions and the competition were exacerbated by colonial rivalries, into which France and Britain were well entrenched and into which Germany and Italy wished to enter. Compounding the colonial empire building and weakening existing empires in Europe were the relatively new and increasingly radical nationalist movements, especially in the Balkans. These 4 factors combined to create a powder keg in Europe that wanted but a spark. In our next lesson, we'll learn about that spark as we explore the short-term causes of the war. If you have any questions about the material, you can leave them in the comments section below or bring them to class. Thank you for listening.